For having me, friends. That reform cycle that you guys would have talked about last week is something that I think many of you have probably gone through in some way. Maybe you're going through it now. I definitely went through it. I've been in Tampa since 2016, so it's approaching 9 years. But before that, I was a part of a community in Southern Illinois, about an hour and a half outside of St. Louis. That was a college town. I went to college there, and as we were actually seniors in college when it all started, but we sort of accidentally stumbled into starting and leading a network of microchurches. We didn't have that language at the time. Um, we were planting Bible studies in every dorm on campus. We felt like we had 4 years to impact the university world, and we wanted to use those years, and um, we wanted to be able to proclaim and demonstrate the kingdom of God amongst our classmates and other students. So we were very committed to campus ministry, but we felt the Lord sort of nudge us and ask us to start to engage some city ministry, community ministry outside the campus, even as college students. And so it was late 2009 when we had, in addition to the campus ministry, we were running a dinner, an everyday dinner soup kitchen for the homeless. We had a prison ministry every Wednesday night that was embedded in the county jail. There was a single moms ministry. There was three house churches. We called them street churches because they would do front yard stuff at the houses that they were at. And if you can believe it, we had a ukulele microchurch in 2009. It was a microchurch led by a family that played ukuleles and built ukuleles in their garage, and they actually convened a bunch of non-Christians to build ukuleles together in their garage, and they would do Discovery Bible Study, halfway through the ukulele build lessons, and then they would like they would teach them how to play worship music. It was just the weirdest thing. But we were not at the time calling these things microchurches. We weren't calling it network. We weren't. It was nothing. We weren't calling it anything. We were just like, as a community, we were just trying to like obey Jesus together every way that he led us, and join with him in every way he was inviting us to, and pull on every kingdom thread that was, exposed to us. And it created this mess of ministry around the city that we were trying to make sense of. But we weren't incorporated. We didn't have an EIN number. We didn't have a bank account. Nobody was on staff. We didn't have like some kind of clarified common language. But we were in the middle of that reform cycle, like matching our lining up our lives against the New Testament, and lining up our understanding of the church against the New Testament, and wondering, do we fit in the pages here? Do we fit do our does my life fit in the pages of Acts? Do our lives fit in the pages of Acts? But we weren't trying to, like, I don't know, we weren't necessarily trying to like reimagine the church or come up with a method or a model or a strategy. And we were still a part of a local church at the time together, that we were trying to like love and serve and be a part of. Um, but we were sort of constantly wondering, like, what is that core question, what is the church? And the messaging to us in those years, 2009, 2010, was like, what the messaging we were getting from the church that we were part of at the time. And we still love those people. I'm still connected. 16 years later, I still love those people, still connected to them, because we didn't have this like axe to grind hostility or anything. But a lot of the messaging at the time was like, hey, what you guys are doing around the city is cool. We appreciate it, as long as it doesn't conflict with your involvement in the church, the capital C church, which is like this Sunday morning thing over here. And we really need you guys to like be here and hold the doors and help make the coffee and hand out the programs or whatever. And we always felt this tension of like, the church that we're a part of, we want to love, we want to serve, but they don't care at all about this stuff we're doing Monday through Saturday. And that stuff we're doing Monday through Saturday makes a lot more sense in the pages of the New Testament. And the stuff we're doing Sunday morning feels a little strange or dissonant, I think, from So we were just trying to work that out. It was like, what is the church? That was like this core live question. What that we were trying to work out together, and we are trying to look for leadership on, and we are trying to read about. And it was in those days and in the middle of the inflection point of that question that we got connected to Tampa Underground, who was 2 or 3 years ahead of us at the time. And we started up a friendship, visited Tampa, they visited us. And a lot of it was like us having this open wondering of what is the church, and inviting them into the dialogue and sort of discovering a theological underpinnings and a theological imagination for a new and fresh paradigm of the church. And that all started. And some of you might be in that same wondering, those same questions, and you're probably doing the same thing. How do you answer that question? What is the church when you're in the middle of that Reformation inflection point? Well, we were trying to return to the pages of the New Testament and the voice of Jesus to see, what did Jesus mean when he said the word church? What did the apostles mean when they said the word church? What was what we sometimes call a New Testament imagination for the church? Meaning, when they said church, what did they think of? What was in their mind? What was conjured in the mind when they would say the word church? I am not actually all that concerned about my nuanced, new, fresh definition of the church. That doesn't matter to me. I don't want some other author's fresh understanding or ideas about the church. That doesn't matter to me. I want to know what Jesus meant by that word church, and I want to know what the New Testament authors, the apostles, meant by that word. I want to know what was triggered in their imagination when they said it, when they used it. So these are just some notes on that idea. If we're returning to Scripture, Jesus used this word ecclesia when he used the word church, when he was trying to refer what it would mean to be like his body of people now and in the future, his body in the world, his people in the world. He used this word ecclesia, and he did not make up that word. It wasn't like this brand new word that he just came up with. Like if I were to go out on my street and try to talk to somebody and just say, I would like to talk to you about flibbertigraphing. It's like some random made up word out of nothing. He used a word that existed in ancient Near East and in Greek to be able to say, like, borrow a term that people understood and say, I mean, that's what I mean. I mean something close to that. So that word ecclesia actually existed at the time. The two root words there are ek, which means in the ancient Near East out, and kaleo, which means call. So just putting those two root words together, it's called out, a people called out. Now, called out for what? If you look at all the examples of where that word is used, both in Jesus or in the context, it was always called out for a people, called out for a specific purpose. Acts 19 is a great example of it, because Acts 19 is an example of people in the context using the word ecclesia to not mean church. It shows you how they used the word, not how Jesus used the word for church, not how Paul or the New Testament used the word for church. It shows you how the context used the word for what it meant to them. And therefore, it gives us a hint or a clue as why Jesus would use it. In Acts 19, in verse 24, it says, a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. And in verse 25, he said he called them all together along with the workers in related tribes. So he's calling together all the silversmiths and all the people in similar crafts or similar trades. And in 3 times throughout that chapter, it refers to the assembly that Demetrius called together of silversmiths and other trades similar. It refers to that assembly as an ecclesia. Like verse 32, where it says the assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. That word assembly is ecclesia. So they saw that word, the context saw that word as almost a civil body of people that shared something in common, and they were called together. They were assembled, gathered, selected, elected to come out and for a purpose, for a reason, usually for the purpose of advocating or civic improvement for a village or something like that, if you look at most of the other places where the language is used. And Jesus is saying, this is my ecclesia, my assembly, my called out ones for a purpose. And our immediate question should be, so what's the purpose that we're called out for? If we are the ecclesia of Jesus, what's the purpose we're called out for? Well, our gathering, the assembly of Jesus, belongs to the purposes of Jesus. So we don't belong. We are not owned. The assembly is not dictated by one singular purpose. It's owned by the fullness of the purposes of God, the fullness of the purposes of Jesus and his kingdom. So that's a lot of purposes. I mean, that's the proclamation and the full sail proclamation and demonstration of the kingdom of God. That is being drastically concerned about lostness. That's leaving the 99 to search for the one. That's finding people who are far from God. It's caring about the whole person. It's caring about feeding those who are hungry, sheltering those who are homeless. It's caring about systems of oppression and injustice. It's thinking about the voiceless and the marginalized. It's thinking about the spiritually marginalized in our communities. It's thinking about anything that gets in the way of kingdom human flourishing. It's thinking about powers and principalities that affect our communities. These are all the purposes of God. So we're not an assembly called out for one singular purpose. We're called out for lots of purposes. Whose purposes? Not Demetrius's, not, mine, not yours. We're called out for the expansive purposes of Jesus. This is the root. This question and this line of logic is the root of David Bosch's famous framework that ecclesiology, which is the study of the church. What is the church? Same as archaeology is the study of historic geography is the study of maps. So it's the science of the church, the study of the church, the what is of the church. Ecclesiology is downflow from missiology. Ecclesiology flows from our understanding of God's purposes in the world. Our ecclesiology is formed by mission. It's formed by our understanding of mission. It's formed by our context and our discernment with what God is doing in our context flows down to our ecclesiology. And missiology flows from our Christology, which is last week. Our missiology isn't what God cares about or what he's doing in our generation or what he's doing in our city or our town or how we go about mission. This is the study of missiology. That's not discerned in a vacuum. It's not discerned in a moment. It's not discerned by sociology or psychology. It's not discerned by individuals. That is downflow from Christology. It's downflow from our obsession with Jesus, our surrender to his voice. He gets to decide the mission. So our obsession with Jesus leads us to be a people who are about what Jesus cares about. And in the going with him on his mission, we find our way into types and forms and structures and imagination for ecclesiology that makes sense in time and place, downflow from missiology. We often get at Hirsch would say, when he talks about David Bosch's framework, Christology leads to missiology, which leads to ecclesiology. When Hirsch talks about it, he has this quick line where he says, mission is the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. Why should ecclesiology be adaptive? Because it is owned by mission. Because it's not static for all time and all places. It's not discerned it is a matter of contextual missional theology to determine how is God trying to reach people in this time, in this place, and how do we order ourselves to be a people who can join with him in that mission, that endeavor. We need a paradigm of the church that unlocks and allows for expansive purposes and possibilities like this. An imagination for the church that isn't static, that doesn't assume that one form of church is meant for all times and all places to reach everyone, because that's just never been the case. The church is God's plan A for his mission. He has no plan B. And his heart is for every person to have multiple opportunities to say yes to him, and for every evil in every city to be contested by a faithful witness of kingdom people. And there is no single form of church that reaches everyone and contests every evil. No method, no strategy, no algorithm can actually be held to that standard or that burden to effectively reach every person and to effectively contest every evil. The latest iteration of an attempt to try was the megachurch. That was the most recent attempt. It's not the only attempt that's been happening in history of a locked, rigid, boxed approach to church that assumes it can reach everyone. Just do it, plug and play. Follow the algorithm, follow the method, follow the tool. It can do it. And we did try. Lots of people tried everywhere and every way. And there were some good things that came out of it. The megachurch was honestly a contextualized version of the church for the 1980s and 1990s. And it had some high points. It had some good to it. It reached people. But the assumption that it can reach all people, that method, that idea, that strategy can effectively reach all people by itself was flawed. The data shows now, if you read the book On the Verge by Dave Ferguson and Alan Hirsch, which was published in the like 2008, 2009, that's an old book now. But that book is where they published the 60-40 principle, the 60-40 percentages. That's an evidence-based, data-based principle that basically they discovered through, I think originally it was through Barna, and now it's been carried on by Pew Research over the last 10, 12 years, that 40% of the population and decreasing would at some point in their lifetime cross the thresholds of a church door or a religious institution of any kind. 60% and decreasing. And actually, the younger the generations got, the worse those numbers got. You know, those numbers were heavily inflated by people who are 40 plus, boomers, Generation X, that kind of stuff. But 60% and growing of the population would never in their lifetime consider the possibility of crossing the doors of a religious institution of any kind. It didn't matter if you had Lecrae. It didn't matter if you had, whatever the best speaker at the time. You have Francis Chan come and do his thing. You have like drop 13,000 Easter eggs from a helicopter. Doesn't change it. There are less than 40% and decreasing will consider it. 60% or more will never consider it. But literally, all of our seminary education, pipelines, definitions, everything was preparing multiple generations of Christian leaders for one form and type and expectation of the church, and we were all fighting over 40% of the population. Nobody was trying to recultivate an alternative imagination for the church, which was meant to not sit back and be attractional, invitational, but a people that actually go incarnationally, missionally bring the church to invade the world of the 60% who will never come. That takes new imagination. It takes new sort of principles and frameworks. It takes new leadership competencies. It takes new paradigms. And by the way, a lot of that stuff's not new, right? It's old. We're rediscovering something very old, very ancient. So what we essentially determined afresh, not for the first time ever, that one form of church cannot reach the whole city. We need hundreds, thousands of forms of the church in one city to reach enough people to make a difference in that city. For there to be a remnant people who can actually catch the winds of revival in a city. There has to be multiple forms. And every single kind of person has to be empowered to reach every kind of person in their own way, with the ability to make contextualized decisions. So what we need, if we're hoping to unlock a paradigm of the church that has expansive purposes, the purposes of God, the purposes of Jesus, which are expansive, they're not singular. If we want to unlock a paradigm of the church that can pursue the expansive purposes of Jesus because it belongs to his mission, then we need a definition of the church that is a beginning, not a box. A paradigm of the church that's a starting place, a minimum, not a maximum. It's a beginning, not a box. A beginning, a trellis from which lots of variations of fruit and garden can grow. A beginning that can develop into all kinds of things, but it shares a similar beginning. Not a box that's handed to people that they must stay within. Not rigidity. We like around here. We like the metaphor of human development for church. Church imagination, church planting, microchurch planting, and microchurch growth. We like the metaphor of human development for the church because for lots of reasons, but because there's a lot of avenues where it's true. There's a lot of different forms of being human, but they're all validated as being human. You don't look at a teenager and wish that they had the decision-making wisdom of a competent adult and think to yourself, "Gosh, I can't wait till you're human." That's what I want to say to my 11-year-old. That's what I'd like to say all the time to my 11-year-old. I can't wait till you're a functioning human. But he's a human. He satisfies the minimum scientific definition of what a human is. But he's not fully developed. There's lots of good things he hasn't learned yet. There's lots of beautiful things he's still got to grow in and develop in. So we don't look at like fully formed adults and think that's what we'll define as church. And everything less than that standard, that box, that standard of maturity, that rigid sort of standard, everything less than that, we're going to give other names, lesser forms of validation. We're going to call them kingdom outposts or, you know, small groups or something like that. Because you gotta get way up here to be the church. No, we would say like babies that are 6 months old, they can't even feed themselves. They are less formed and less mature than a toddler, but they're still a human being. They should be validated as a human being because they meet the minimum standard. And they should be encouraged to grow in things that are beautiful and helpful and desired but not required to be human. The same is true of like an ecclesial minimum, an ecclesiological minimum, a minimum understanding, a stripped back understanding of what it means to be the church. This minimum can be a faithful expression of what we see in Scripture, faithful to the revelation of Scripture of what it means to be the church in a minimum form, but also gives those people expansive purposes, ways to be that are expansively faithful to the heart of God and expansive and creative possibilities of how they can grow and develop beyond that minimum. Feel free to grow and mature and scale beyond that minimum, but they all start the same way. That minimum allows for quick start. It allows for scalability. It allows for the reduction of fear in missionaries and in potential microchurch leaders that are intimidated by the idea of microchurch. And there should be a high amount of respect and sober-mindedness about starting a microchurch. It's a serious task, even if it's just like 6, 8, 10 people in a living room. It's a high call, a high responsibility. But people should not be disqualifying themselves in their own mind from leading a microchurch because of what they think it's supposed to be is $300,000 in a stage and the ability to preach. That's not required. That's not potentially for you part of an ecclesial minimum that would disqualify a person. So it minimizes the fear in disciples or minimizes their ability to disqualify themselves from potentially leading one now or in the future. It gives them the ability to aspire to such things. And it secures for us revival potential. We don't actually bring about revival. We can't. There's no framework or tool or algorithm to do it. But it gives us revival potential. If God wants to blow the winds, we can catch it. So an empowering minimum also comes with quite a bit of risk. And that might contribute to the difficulty of naming the minimum, because we might start thinking about an ecclesial minimum, a New Testament imagination minimum for our time. And before you can name it, you start wondering, well, that's going to cause me lots of problems. It's going to cause us lots of problems. And how do we prevent those problems? And it slows us down from even naming it. I mean, you probably know what some of those fears or some of those problems. You probably have people around you because you're considering this. You're considering microchurches, or you're currently practitioners of microchurches. John, I know John's a current practitioner of microchurch life. There's probably people around you, even if you're not thinking about the risks or the downsides. You got plenty of people around you telling you about the risks and the downsides of doing simple stuff, doing house church stuff. And what do those sound like? Those sound like heresy. How do you control heresy? How do you mitigate the risk of false teaching? You just like letting anybody teach anything nowadays. You're not requiring seminary degrees or something like that. So that's a perceived risk. There's the fear of return on investment, quality control, efficiency, quality of impact. How do you know? How do you know what people are doing? Can 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 a micro church, can a simple church, a New Testament imagination church have the same return on investment of something like a more structured, institutionalized, organized mega something? That's a return on investment problem. And how do we even know that? How do we track that? Um, and all those things lead to those fears of the risks involved, the perceived risks involved can lead us to having a bias toward no. So I just wanted to take a note of that really quick before we go into like a time of like dialogue and reflection. And we won't send you guys away to like reflection groups. We'll just sort of like stay all together. I'm just gonna have a moment where we can sort of dialogue together. But as we're thinking about like an ecclesial minimum and naming a minimum, and we're going to encourage you guys to discern your own. Don't take ours. Our ecclesial minimum, I think it's great and you're free to take it. But ours is really just like the way that we answered the principles. You might answer the key to this environment is like let's dialogue about the principles, but let you come to your own answers. Let you come to your own definitions for your context and to listen to Jesus about what maybe that minimum should be for you. But even while you're doing that, you're going to be tripping on some of these fears of like releasing people to do the minimum. And if you're going to embrace a minimum, you should take a moment at least to discern am I what are my tripping points of telling people no? What are the things that are going to cause me or us, our community, to want to say no? The things that I think are a bad idea, the things and it's just personal bias and preference. There are people that are different than me that cause distrust. They think differently than me. They talk differently than me, and because of that, it's going to cause distrust, and I'm going to be hesitant to say yes because of my distrust. Or our current vision statement, mission statement, strategy does not currently allow room for us to say yes to certain things that might actually meet our minimum. And can we how do we expand our ability to say yes to people that are called by Jesus and they want to satisfy a minimal ecclesiology? And are we prepared for that? I just think one of the best examples we have locally is Carissa with Hula for Happiness. Maybe you've heard the Hula for Happiness story, but I think might have been 2012, 2013. You guys met Jeremy last week. So Jeremy looks like a police officer. He talks like a police officer, and he looks like he just spent the morning processing a deer that he shot at 5 a.m., to feed his family. That's what he looks like. And he had this woman, Carissa, walk into his office, and Carissa is someone I would describe as eccentric. Jeremy describes her as a dirty hippie. I try to avoid brash language, but I would call her eccentric. She wouldn't wear shoes. She came into his office that day wearing like a pink flowing dress. She did not have her shoes on, and she had dreadlocks. I don't think she had put any sort of chemical and product in that hair for decades, and I think she had weaved into her dreadlocks like twigs and like leaves and sticks or something. And she walked into he describes it as dancing into his office like in her flowing dress and basically said, "I would like to hula hoop for Jesus." And Jeremy had a bias toward no. Let's say that. Let's say that. And he had lots of reasons to say no. First of all, that sounds like the dumbest idea, like for a ministry to Jeremy and to me currently, that he'd ever heard of in years of doing this. And two, it wasn't just that the ministry idea sounded like maybe a bad idea that wasn't going to work. Two, this is potentially an actual crazy person that we're deliberating whether or not to like say yes to or green light or empower. So Jeremy thought to himself, well, we have a few cards to play here. So he told Carissa, unfortunately, we don't say yes to everything. I hear you, love your passion, love that you've discerned from the Lord that He's like gifted you, wired you, called you to like use your gifts to reach people. We want to help you in some way, but unfortunately, we don't think everything's the church. We don't say yes to everything as the church. We only say yes to things that satisfy our ecclesial minimum, which we'll talk about later on the call. So he said, it's got to be a thing that's going to be like worship, community, mission. It's got to be like formed as church, believed to be church. We don't just say yes to everything. And she said, "Oh, I've looked at your ecclesial minimum and all the pieces about it, and that's exactly what I want it to be." And Jeremy said, "Oh no, oh no." He said, "Well, we don't say yes to every microchurch. There are lots of things that are microchurch that we say no to because they don't agree with our manifesto values, or because they're not in line with our theological statements, or because they can't agree to the leadership covenant, our leadership standards of expectation. So there's plenty of microchurches that don't fit within the sandbox of our community, and we have to say no to those." And she said, "I've read all those documents and I wept. It's exactly who I want to be and what I believe and what I value." And Jeremy said, "Oh no, I think we have to help this person." And so we did. And within the first year, she'd shared the gospel with over 10,000 people. She made these hula hoops that were like in pieces, that were the five colors of the gospel. I didn't grow up Southern Baptist, so I don't understand these things, but like black, yellow, green, white, red, or something. So they were like disassembled hula hoops, and she would take like pallets of these hula hoops to parks and have all these kids gather for these hula hoop classes, and she would have them assemble their hula hoops part by part while sharing with them the story of the gospel. And then at the end of it, they would have these hula hoop sort of like recreational training sessions to learn how to hula hoop. And she would be able to share that hula hoop is an act of joy. It's an experience of joy. And all joy in the human experience flows from this story that I've shared with you. She like shared, there's like rapid seed spreading evangelism. They multiplied all these joy spreading chapters in parks all over the country. They ended up creating discipleship curriculum for kids coming out of brothels in India to ground them in the love of God through hula hoops. And we were going to tell her no because she didn't look like a potential leader and because the idea didn't sound like a good idea to us. We had lots of reasons to say no, and we would have been wrong. So I'd love to be able to just have a second together to just like debrief and to be able to and I'll give you just a maybe 30 seconds to process these two questions before we talk openly. So and then everybody can just sort of jump in, but I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to think about it before we jump in. You can just share big takeaways from like expansive ecclesiology, the need for a minimum generally, that kind of thing. But even this last bit about that a simple ecclesiology feeling tricky or complicated because we have fears as leaders. We have. Can you name some fears about releasing leaders? Are there ways that we are tempted to control? And can we name those? Are there people or ideas where we tend to withhold permission? So you can either sort of openly share about your personal We're in the trust tree with the nest, safe space. So you can openly share about like if you have some ways that you do feel hesitant or fearful around releasing people or things that you tend to trip you up on being able to say yes. Or it can just be like big ideas. What are you hearing? What's compelling? Um, so take a second to just process. If you need to like write it down or type it or something like that, just to process your thoughts, like 30 seconds. Okay, your 30 seconds is up. So I've sort of tried to just talk at like the principled level of like why have a minimum at all? Why what are the values behind that minimum? What is the church? Like strip it all the way back to like Jesus, New Testament imagination. And I'll spend the rest of our, 15, 20 minutes here just giving the way that we answered some of these principles in our story. So I'm just going to give you the example, like the Tampa story example, um, of our ecclesial minimum, how it looks, and you're free to take those things and run with them. But you can see these things as just an example in an attempt to root the principles. But you're very free to sort of discern your own answers in context. So yeah, we have an ecclesial minimum. Our ecclesial minimum, our minimum understanding of what the church is. When we say church, this is what we mean. And we have a community of people that when they hear the word church, this is what they imagine. What we mean by church, by ecclesial minimum, is worship, community, and mission. These three elements. We have three circles: worship, community, mission. Now, what we mean by those words, because those words mean different things to different people, is by community, we mean extended spiritual family. We mean interdependent mutual community. We mean a group of people living their lives with enough overlap that they can do the one another's with each other. And that requires more than 2 hours once a week and a WhatsApp thread. It requires like a lot of overlapping life together. Um, by worship, we don't necessarily mean music, singing, guitar, whatever, Hillsong or, what Maverick City. All that stuff's good. There's a lot of microchurches that do that stuff. It's just not what we mean. By worship, we mean Romans 12. We mean our lives are in full surrender to Jesus as a living sacrifice as our spiritual act of worship. So we mean the extended spiritual family is in full surrender to Jesus in all things as a living sacrifice. And together that worshipful community is pursuing collectively some piece of the mission of God in the city to proclaim and demonstrate the kingdom of God among the lost and the poor. That's what we mean by mission. There has to be some crossing of a threshold from the kingdom to not the kingdom. Like there has to be a crossing of a boundary to like reach the unreached, to the margins, going together, taking the risk, um, in some way collectively. Some piece of the purposes of God, not the fullness of the purposes of God, but the piece that he has for our microchurch to play. This is what we mean by worship, community, mission. I'll just give you a few examples of that. Stacy, by the way, I do not have the chat up, so if anybody asks a question, just that like seems relevant for me to answer right away, just jump in. But otherwise, if we can hold it till the end, I'm just not watching it, so I'm not ignoring anybody. So a few examples. My house church is called Belmont. What it was for many years called Belmont House. Now it's called Troas. But our house church is in a neighborhood called Belmont Heights Estates. It's a house church. We've been inside this neighborhood for 9 years. This neighborhood contains the largest saturation of government subsidized housing in Tampa Bay. It's 895 units of Section 8 housing over a 26-acre plot just outside of downtown Tampa. And we've got a handful of families that have lived on this block with us for a long time. We're very committed to our neighbors. We do, open dinners and discovery Bible studies and accountability groups. We have a life together. So we are living out worship, community, mission. There's a microchurch called Faith and Fitness that is a community of CrossFitters that is together reaching a specific CrossFit gym, CrossFit Downtown Heights. And they do a Discovery Bible study inside that gym on Thursday nights, and they do spiritually themed workouts 3 or 4 times a year. I don't know what that even means, but I know that I know the Easter time they do a workout that's patterned after the Stations of the Cross. So I understand what that means. It's a really creative outreach, and if you survive the CrossFit workout, you get to take communion at the end. If you make it. So there's a microchurch called Urban Youth Justice that's planting microchurches inside of every juvenile detention facility across a 5-county radius. There's a microchurch called Created that is a community of women that are in total surrender and submission to Jesus that are reaching other women that are vulnerable, oftentimes in human trafficking, often in the sex industry, in prostitution, in strip clubs, in brothels, in Tampa. There's a microchurch called Timothy Initiative that's working to restore broken men that are coming out of homelessness, incarceration, detox facility. There's a microchurch called Everlasting that is a group of ultimate frisbee players that are embedded in an ultimate frisbee league at Lassing Park, and they prayer walk the place where they play frisbee every Thursday morning, and they invite other players to do devotionals or house church stuff every Sunday after they play. There's a microchurch called Justice Restoration Center that's made up of a team of lawyers that provide pro bono services for human trafficking victims to help expunge their records and provide family law to restore them to their kids that got lost to the system. There's a microchurch called Special Fathers Network that's led by a man in his 70s that has at this point an adult child that has serious special needs, and that he's convened a microchurch made up of the fathers of special needs kids to be able to support them, be in community, and be able to reach and make disciples of other men who are fathers of special needs kids. This is an example of an ecclesial minimum that holds to theological acuity and potency of what the church is in the New Testament, but allows and unlocks for expansive possibilities to tap into the fullness of the purposes of God. All these microchurches share very little in common. They use different language, they use different tools, they come up with different discipleship curriculums, they use different evangelism strategies, they have different rhythms of life, different outreaches, different metrics that matter to them, but they share one common centerpiece to every microchurch: a sense of calling from Jesus. There's not a single microchurch in the underground that is a volunteer that's doing it because someone asked them to. They're missionaries going about it because Jesus asked them to, as an act of worship and faithfulness. This is our ecclesial minimum. Worship, community, and mission flowing out of a common origin story of a sense of missionary destiny to be a people who reaches a context of people. You don't need to copy our minimum. We would ask you not to, We would ask you to discern with Jesus what it should be. And if it ends up being ours, thumbs up. But if you add a fourth circle or a fifth circle because he's asked you to and it makes sense for your context, do that. If he asks you to use different language but have similar ones, do that. The point is not to just have ours. The point is that you must have one. The point is that you must have a minimum. Now, each of these simple microchurches, these minimal microchurches, we've learned over time that they have to exist in two spaces. So we're just going to share with you a few things that we've learned about microchurches over time. We wouldn't have known this in the early days, but over time, over 15, 20 years, we've learned to find language that helpfully describes things that microchurches go through. So microchurches exist in two spaces together. Ralph Winter would call these spaces sodalic spaces and modalic spaces. Now, that basically means like when they get together, when they're around each other, when these microchurches convene in environments, are those spaces, those environments, those gatherings, sodalic or modalic? What we mean by sodalic, what Ralph Winter meant by sodalic, is spaces of risk, adventure, apostolic mission, the frontier. It's uncomfortable. You have to you have to cross some kind of threshold. These are missional spaces. They're pushing the boundaries. They're asking you to lay down your life, to take risks, to get uncomfortable, to be inconvenienced for the sake of mission. Modalic environments would be spaces of comfort, psychological safety, healing, belonging, community. Now, what Ralph Winter was writing about all those years ago when he brought up this language, part of what he was writing about was he was making the case that the church was at some point began to believe about itself that it was meant to be a modalic entity, a solely modalic community that only provided healing and psychological safety and comfort and wholeness and community. And it cut off from itself its sodalic function. And that the rise of the parachurch was actually filling in the void of the sodalic function of the church that it had given up. So campus ministries, urban ministries, mentoring programs, all these things, that these missions agencies filled the gap of a piece of the church that was never meant to be cut off from itself. We would essentially use this language to help microchurches understand that there's no such thing as a sodalic microchurch. There's no such thing as a modalic microchurch. But every single microchurch has to figure out a way of life together that carries the community through both spaces, through spaces of risk and the frontier, and spaces of healing and community and safety and belonging. And when microchurches feel a little off, or they feel a little anemic, or something's not quite right, usually if we're in a coaching session with microchurches, it's because they barely have a pulse on one of those spaces. And it's usually because they're trying to fit the entire life of the microchurch into one event per week. And it's forcing them to have to choose one or the other. So some microchurches are like doing mission all the time, on the frontier all the time. And they get 6 months down the road and they're like, something's not quite right. Like, people don't actually feel connected to each other. It doesn't really feel like we're family. It just feels like we're working really hard and strained. And it's like, yeah, because you don't have a lot of modalic environments to cultivate family and belonging. Or you might have a house church that like gets together for dinner every week, and you get 6 months down the road and it's like, gosh, I think we love each other. I think we're a community, but like it's not really clear how we're participating in the mission of God, how we're like inconveniencing ourselves, taking risks, like reaching people, finding people, getting uncomfortable. So we would try to help people understand you have to cultivate together in your microchurch a way of life, a rule of life, some kind of pattern that carries you through both these spaces. Now, as microchurches figure that out, as they figure out together how to be carried through two spaces, they will settle into being one of two different types of microchurch. Now, again, this isn't prescriptive. It's descriptive. It's not like microchurches are saying, this is what type of microchurch I am. It's just us looking at the network and saying, every one of these microchurches is one of two types. The first type is what we call specific mission microchurches. Those would be specific microchurches where the community is gathering around a specific sense of missionary calling to a common people group. So some of those that I mentioned earlier, like Faith and Fitness, they're reaching a CrossFit gym, or UIJ, they're reaching the juvenile detention facilities, or Urban Fellowship, we're working with gang youth in North Tampa, or the JRC. A lot of those are mission-specific microchurches, which means if I don't feel called to that people group, if I don't feel like the Lord is asking me to reach those people, if I don't feel some missionary destiny, I'm not going to join that microchurch. I can't join that microchurch because that's what they're doing together. That's what the community there is doing together. So what happens is with mission-specific microchurches, the growth can sometimes feel slow because they're deep in a context, and it's not like anybody can just join it. But their transformational impact in that context can be very deep, very, very deep. The other type of microchurch is what we call a distributive microchurch, or sometimes we use the language of incubator microchurch. So a distributive microchurch is a community that's not gathered around the exact same sense of calling or mission to the same people. It's a community that's gathering around a shared sense of values and a vision for missionary life and accountability to those values and missionary life together, but they're doing it in different places. So they're going maybe 2 by 2 or 3 by 3, like to live out a sense of calling in different places. So it's distributive. The mission that community is stewarding together is distributed. when we started our house church 9 years ago in Belmont Heights, it started out called Belmont House, and it was a mission specific house church to the neighborhood we live in. We were reaching a geography. You could not join our house church unless you moved into the geography. Well, in 2020, we had a handful of families on our block that had been a part of our community for years that were starting to discern a sense of like Ephesians 2:10 missionary calling to other people, not in the neighborhood, like the faith and fitness people. Or like there's this couple that reaches social board gamers, like board games I've never heard of, like Cones of Dunshire. They're like playing games that are like deep in the dark webs. But it's like a community that they're connected to. And they're discerning a sense of calling to communities that aren't the neighborhood, but they live on my block and they're a part of our house church. So I thought, like, well, if these people are going to be faithful to their calling, do we have to kick them out? Because like we're reaching the neighborhood. So it's like, do I have to kick these people out? Well, no, that's not what we did. We essentially became a distributive microchurch that is holding a lot of people in community, in a house church community, but those people are trying to be faithful and obedient to a calling from Jesus to reach other places. So we changed the name of our microchurch from Belmont House to Troas, and around 2020, 2021. And now we've got, my wife and I are still trying to reach the neighborhood. Still feel very called to the neighborhood. There's a couple that's doing the CrossFit ministry stuff. There's a couple doing social board gaming. We have a married couple in our house church that are Messianic Jews that are trying to reach the Jewish community through the Jewish cultural festivals. And there's a couple people in our house church that are doing campus ministry with college students at USF. But we feel collectively like responsible for the mission. We're praying for each other. We're coaching each other. We're getting involved in each other's ministries where it makes sense if people need help. And this would be an example of how earlier Kimberly asked the question, what would you do with a person that's quarter-baked, but they have a sense of calling and they think they want to start a microchurch? We would usually tell that person like, hey, instead of greenlighting you as a microchurch right now, why don't you get incubated? Join a distributive house church. And then and we're saying yes to your calling. So you can be faithful to that sense of calling while incubated in a distributive house church that helps you develop, helps you grow, supports you, and watches your character, over time. So, um, so that would be two spaces, two types, our ecclesial minimum.